Welcome to the endgame past the endgame. The endgame, if you will. Or as I'd like to call it, Fairies Frontline. Fairies are simple drones with specialized AIs developed by Parasica, which believes that it is literally a fairy. With it, you gain access to the fairy chamber, where various miniature models exist and needs to be upgraded much like the data room. There are a total of 4 infrastructure that needs to be upgraded. The primary one that acts as the data table for the fairy chamber, it must be leveled up in order to level up other infrastructures. And you have 3 other secondary infrastructures which will increase the amount of fairy points you regenerate, which are needed to use fairy skills, increase the maximum number of fairy points you can accumulate, and increase the amount of EXP fairies will earn per battle. Fairy points are regenerated 4 times a day at 6-hour intervals at 0300, 0900, 1500, and 2100. You can gain access to fairies once you beat 60 missions and are only able to obtain them from doing heavy equipment productions. Now, from a canonical perspective, they've been hinted at during Q+, as Parasica mentions that she's found the opportunity to reinitiate the research on the drone technology, but is only actually shown for the first time during the deep dive incident. The first fairy to show up being the bullshit search fairy. As to why fairies are able to support dolls, it goes back to how Parasica designed the command modules for the dolls' dummies. After finding out how the Sangvis handled their command module, which is similar to a tree and it has its roots, Parasica designed it so that Griffin dolls would have a command module similar to a net and everything is parallel with one another. The former is a much more optimal solution but lacks flexibility, but vice versa for the latter. This is where drones come in, and they become the quote-unquote roots of the doll's command modules and optimize it, resulting in strengthening the dolls and their abilities and support through their individual unique skills. Before I move on to explain the mechanics in depth, do take the canon explanations with a pinch of salt, as they're only there to give you a synopsis more than anything, and they're not meant to give you a full rundown on the fairies within the canon. If you're interested in that, I'm pretty sure there are other sources for you to look at. Now, fairies can be categorized as either combat fairies or strategic fairies, and also has 3 distinct characteristics. 1, they give stat buffs that are applied to the entire squad for just being part of it. 2, talents that are procced by a percentage that correlates to the rarity and has a chance to proc every battle and buffs dolls if procced. And 3, skills that can be leveled up and used to give you an edge in combat against enemies. Now, when it comes to skills, combat fairies influence the next encounter with the enemy, while strategic fairies influence the next turn and the entirety of it. Therefore, combat fairies don't have any cooldown to their skills, but strategic fairies do for balancing purposes. Through the usage of the auto skill function, you can automatically use combat fairy skills per encounter if turned on, including during the enemy's turn. However, if you only wanted to turn a few specific fairy skill on, you can turn the auto skill function off and turn the specific fairy skills on, then end the turn. Do note, for most parts, fairies will eat up double the amount of skill chips and time it takes to train their skills when compared to dolls. This isn't always the case, but it is the majority of times, with the need of 200 basic chips and 2 hours to level from 1 to 2, and 480 advanced chips and 48 hours from level 9 to 10 being an example. Fairies and dolls cannot use the same research slot when being trained, so you will need individual slots if you want to level both at the same time, so take that into consideration. Maybe you want to go ahead, pull that credit card out, and buy some research slots if you want. It is very convenient. On the bright side though, there is only a small handful of fairies that must be skill leveled and others can be left alone, though I'll talk about this more on the end of the video. Now that we've looked at the active part about fairies, all that's left are the two passive parts: the stat buffs and the talent buffs. The stat buff is pretty simple and straightforward. It's a buff that the fairy will give to the squad just for being part of it. Simple and done. Every fairy has a unique set of stats they buff, as well as individual unique base stats and increment scalars, which increases the base stat every time a fairy levels up. Not only that, a fairy's rarity also affects the stat buffs, being that the higher rarity the fairy is, the higher the base stat is multiplied. The buff is calculated as such that it is multiplied to the result of the stat after calculating in equipment and affection stats to it. Fair warning for the math nerds out there, the fairy stat buffs that are displayed in game have been rounded up, and any math done with fairies, the product must be rounded up as well before being taken in to be multiplied by other parts of the stat formula. If you do want to do precise calculations, you'll have to go around looking for the precise buff percentages the fairies give, otherwise you're not going to be getting accurate results. If you don't care though, then don't worry about it. Now moving on, you've got talents. Talents are passive buffs that have a random chance to get procced respective to a doll's rarity. The higher rarity the doll, the higher the percentage that it'll proc, and if the fairy's a 5-star, it will always proc 100% of the time. Now, when you produce a fairy from the heavy production, a talent is randomly chosen amongst the talent pool filled with 17 talents. But as a rule of thumb, out of these 17, only 3 of them actually matter. The 3 being damage tier 1, damage tier 2, and morale, which is technically a tier 2 talent. These are the 3 most widely used talents due to them being simplistic in that all they do is buff your squad's firepower. Simple and done. And if you haven't figured it out already, firepower is the king of stats to buff. Now, there are some talents that specific fairies need for specific comps, but those are the exception, which I'll also talk about at the end of the video. Now, talents are categorized as either tier 1 or tier 2 talents. Tier 1 talents have a higher chance to be procced with their respective rarity fairies compared to tier 2 talents, but tier 2 talents provide a higher scaling on the buffs they provide. Due to the lower proc chance at lower rarity, realistically you're better off sticking with a tier 1 talent until you hit about 3-star or 4-star, then calibrate towards a tier 2 talent. Of course, this is in the realm of optimality, and you could just get away from the start with a tier 2 talent till the end of time. It's up to you to decide if you want to start with a tier 2 talent to future-proof your fairy, or start with a tier 1 talent for the immediate benefits. But regardless, talents are recalibratable with just a small cost of 60 calibration tickets, 600 manpower, 600 ammo, 600 rations, and 200 parts per calibration. Do note, when calibrating, Tier 2 talents have a lower chance to show up than Tier 1 talents. Duh. And precisely because the recalibration cost is so cheap, people have thought of ways to optimize getting the right talents for their fairies. You either A, keep pulling for duplicate fairies when you first start till you get the talent you want on the fairy you want it on, then use whatever you've gathered up to that point to upgrade your fairy. Or 2, just start leveling your first fairy right away and gather dupes over time. Once you're ready to start calibrating, whenever talent that you have on your duplicate fairies show up, use those fairies to upgrade your base fairy and keep calibrating till you get the talent you're looking for. Just to clarify, when I say calibrate, oh, you have a talent, upgrade, rinse and repeat, I mean that your priority is getting the talent of your choice, and upgrading fairies with the same talent, it's just a secondary priority. Although there was a bug back in the day where the game wasn't processing the talent's buff, and as a result it just thrown in the garbage can, but that's been patched out as of October 26, 2017, and it won't pose an issue. Probably. Who knows? Now, all this time I've been talking about rarity and upgrades, and you're probably sitting there like, what the fuck? So here's what I've been rambling on about. When it comes to fairies, they have levels and rarity. Levels are needed to increase the base stat of the stat buffs, as well as being able to hit higher rarity, and each rarity has a level threshold that must be met before the fairy can be promoted to its respective rarity. Now, if all you needed to do was lower your fairy to reach a higher rarity, that'd be too easy, and Mika doesn't do easy. On top of those level thresholds, you have development points, if you will, and their own respective thresholds that is relevant to level thresholds. Both of them must be met for the fairy to be promoted up by 1 rarity. Now, you can increase the development points by feeding fairies into a fairy you are leveling. Feeding identical fairies will yield 100 development points, while any other fairies will yield 10% of that. If you feed a fairy that is identical and also has the same talent, it will yield 150 points. Any other fairies with the same talent will also yield 10% of that. You first start off as a 1-star and you work your way up to a 5-star. Like I mentioned, every rarity has a level and respective development point threshold, and you result at level 100 and a 5-star rarity fairy once you've reached the end. You're usually better off feeding identical fairies due to such high yields and development points when trying to hit those development point thresholds. Now, once you've managed to earn 9,009,909,000 EXP, because fairies need 3 times the amount of EXPs dolls normally need, and after you've fed a minimum of 20 fairies to a maximum of 300 fairies, you finally earned yourself a fairy that's almost game breaking and gives you 2.5 times the base of its stat buff and always procs its talent. It's a lot of work, so you best get started now. And that's about it when it comes to introducing fairies. It's a lot to take in at first glance, but it'll be second nature in a few weeks or a few months. You'll get used to it. Now this is just the intro, and I'll have a more in-depth breakdown where I talk about every fairy and all the niche uses they have and don't have. So look forward to that. But the next video will finally be the machine gun breakdown, so look forward to that.